bit more about sort of my background, so you know who I am a bit more. So I worked for the majority of my career in the health service as a speech and language therapist with people with acquired neurological disorders. Worked in that for nearly 20 years, and then was decided in my sort of moment of madness to retrain as an ordained Anglican minister, but very much with the intention of going into chaplaincy. And the University of Chester is where I've been for the last 5 years, and a senior chaplain for the last 3. So just to give you my context, really, my passion really is a lot around student well-being and preventative health, and how in a time of really very deep crisis for our communities, our young people, but obviously university includes people of many ages, how do we begin to address what is actually, you know, sort of really significant challenges that our communities have. And that's the context really for me to share. And I'm going to share my screen and give you some pictures. And this is really just my learning from my practice that I share with you as a way of perhaps opening discussion alongside Al and Reuben as well. So if you would just give me a second, I will hopefully be able to share. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see that okay. And my title is The Creativity of Decomposition. I think it's something I've sort of explored over the last probably sort of 8-9 years in the ministry that I've been involved in. And hopefully the reason I say that it's creative will become a little bit clearer as I sort of talk through my slides. And really, this is for me in my practice a tale of 2 cities. So 2 cities, 2 places, and 2 gardens. So the first garden and the first city is Liverpool, and it's in St Michael's Church, which where I was a curate in about 2017. And St Michael's Church was due to close. It had just a few older people, and it had probably had more locks on its gates than it did have people in its pews. And it just had really struggled in terms of place, because it had become a place of regeneration, a place of gentrification, and the church had ended up in the middle of a place that it no longer had any connections whatsoever with. And you can see on the right there, that was the garden that was once a flourishing garden that had just got into disrepair. And as a bit of a last ditch attempt, in order that it didn't close, we spoke to an organisation called Faiths for Change, that's an environmental charity in Liverpool. And we took them to the garden that is about 8-foot high weeds and brambles in it, and sort of said, is there anything we can do? And Annie, who's leads Faith for Change, looked at it and said, yeah, I reckon so. And with that, we went on a bit of a journey. I was very skeptical, I have to say. You know, they had about 3 people in their organisation, mainly part-time. And I was like, what on earth are we doing? Where are we going with this garden? But I went on a journey that actually really profoundly changed my ministry, profoundly changed the way I see working in communities, the way I understand place in really significant ways. And I'll say a bit more about how as I go through. So the other place I arrived at in 2020, just after, well, yeah, just as lockdown started, but I started as senior chaplain in 2022, was at the University of Chester. And the garden, as you can see down the bottom there, had just been sort of obliterated, I think, by a marquee mainly during lockdown. And but along with that, chaplaincy was struggling to find its place. We were all Anglican ordained when I arrived in chaplaincy, but we were in an increasingly international multi-faith community. And so I spoke to our Vice Chancellor and said, we need to profoundly change. If we're going to serve our community, we need to understand what chaplaincy means for the coming years, because we're not the same community we were as in 1839 when we were a Christian teacher training college when we were established. And in a sense, chaplaincy had lost its sense of place. Who are we in 2022 in terms of serving this community? And what does this space look like if it's not going to just be a small Christian community? What is it now? And so I thought, well, if Annie did it at Liverpool and I've learned anything, I should be able to do the same again. If I really believe that there is something in this transformation that is thoroughly rooted in the sort of soil around us, in that sense of people coming together and rediscovering place, reimagining place for their season, then presumably I can go on a journey again. And I think I want to just share a couple of reflections really of those two experiences that have sort of perhaps helped me navigate the complexities really of some of that work. And the first thing I want to say is that I've learnt it's about letting go, and what I call, well, what actually Barbara Brown Taylor calls the practice of getting lost. And I love that term. I think about it an awful lot in the work I do, because I often feel like I'm getting very lost. And this was the garden that I started with. And soon after I started as senior chaplain, the sort of facilities people came around and said, Jill, you know, we'll sort the garden. I know it's a mess. We'll get it sorted. We'll do it next week. And I said, no, it's fine. Just leave it. I'm actually going to do a project with with the students, and they're going to rebuild it. And but I didn't have any money. I didn't really know what it was going to be at all. And but I had a sense in which this was integral of us as chaplaincy rediscovering what it meant to be in this place, in the middle of the heart of the university. And part of it was then embracing the lack of certainty and the lack of control. I didn't know how we were going to do it. And in a way, I was going to become utterly dependent on the students and on staff and on other things to make it happen. And I realised that actually one of the things I learned from Liverpool was it was about listening to the ecosystem, listening to the space around me, listening to the sort of literally the earth beneath my feet, listening to the stories people had to tell, listening to the community that was now and the needs of that community, the hopes of that community, sort of what people wanted to talk about. So we spent a long time just talking, just saying, if we did something to this garden, what would you want us to do? What would you like to do? What would you like to get involved in? And just actually having those conversations. But that practice of getting lost is one that I had to come back to again and again, of feeling I don't actually know why we've started this journey and I don't know where we're going, but I think it's probably a good one to be on. And so gradually things emerged. And the other thing I learned then was that it was gentle action, what I call gentle action. And that's, you know, that sense in which it was allowing things to gradually and slowly emerge. It didn't all come together all at once. I didn't really have an overarching sort of sense of where we were going. And also there was something about being gentle on the land and on the people, letting the land sort of regenerate, letting the, you know, and find its own place, but also letting people sort of contribute gradually, feel like they're finding their place and have something to offer. The one of that picture at the top is of a staff member, and his wife had died. She was also at the university, and he had heard about the garden, and he said, Jill, could I donate some money for a herb garden? And that was often what happened, is something just emerged, you know, where somebody offered something. And so he came and he planted. He said, my wife loved herbs. She would be so happy to know that this herb garden's here. And those students down the bottom are students who were the first ones who started to say, that student standing the other side of the rail is called Jude, and he was like, I want a pond in the garden. I was like, okay, go and get a shovel then and start digging. And so he did, and we now do have a peace garden at the end of our garden that Jude inspired and caused to grow. So those things happened. But I realized actually increasingly we needed values around what did it mean for us? What values did we need to have? And I'm going to share those with you in a minute. But it was definitely about learning together. It was about listening to one another. I'm not a gardener, really. I like gardens, but I'm not really that skilled in gardening. So I was just very dependent on other people. Jude knew loads about ponds, so we just listened to him in terms of what we needed. And so gradually there was this sense of space and place, and it being this sacred reimagining for me. That's how I would articulate it. Other people who use the garden would say things perhaps differently, but for me it was this sacred, deeply sacred reimagining of place. And we've sort of gradually started to work out what our values were about. And we talked about what did chaplaincy understand its values to be. And in a way, these gradually emerged over the last few years as we've lived in the garden, lived in the hub that is sort of a hub for students. And those roots are really important to us, things we come back to, that it's about the sacredness of life, it's about radical hope, alongside and with. I think that's probably one of the central tenets of what I do, that actually it's about everybody together, listening together, going alongside people, respect, openness, listening to one another, honesty, integrity, care and belonging. And those values really matter, because I've heard people talk about similar projects, but without those values, things can actually be very different, actually, really. Because they're sort of emerge in a different way. And I think what we see then is, out of those roots, spiritual well-being beginning to emerge. You have food. We use food a lot. We have community table a lot from the food we grow. Often people end up with music. There's the garden, the creative communities. We often try to allow things to creatively emerge. Prayer is part of many of us who are in the garden a lot. Friendships, support, welcome, pastoral care and support. And so those values sort of guide us increasingly, so that we know what we're about and what we're not about, really, as well. And I've learned about the creativity of waiting, and the lessons of perseverance, of patience and hope, because when you haven't got money and many people, we don't have loads of people in the garden. And sometimes we have seasons where it's been very quiet, the student engagement has been lower. I remember saying to Annie from Face for Change, oh, I didn't know whether I've got it right, because I'm struggling to sort of make the way forward. And she said, Jill, it's about perseverance, hold your nerve. She said, there will be seasons. There will be seasons that actually just will be quiet. You just need to sort of work through them. And it was really important for me to hear that from her. And she was right, because actually another season came, but actually allowing those seasons to come and go was really important. That sense of composting the old to allow space for the new, that action in the garden of composting. You'll see our composter there. We've got a hot composter now, which is very exciting because we haven't got much space. So we now do hot composting as well as our normal composting. And just that sense of each season allowing sort of fresh things to emerge. We always are reimagining what the garden is going to be for the future. And I think that countercultural idea of rest as productive time, that actually, those quieter seasons are actually productive in their own way. They allow us to sort of continue to imagine and reimagine the space. And I think within that, for me, there's this spiritual practice of waiting, a spiritual practice of that gentle action as well, of the listening, of the alongside and with. And really important for me, a college alumni who was in the sort of what was then Chester College, now university, painted that picture for me, and it hangs in my room. And it just reminds me, this is what we're about. We're about this planting of seeds in all sorts of ways in the life of our community. And those 3 passages mean a lot to me. What is the kingdom of God like? To what shall we compare it? It is like a mustard seed, which a person took and put in their garden. Those simple acts of planting seeds again and again. And in a way, the faith and the hope that's required to do that. The kingdom of God is as if a person should scatter seeds on the ground. And that last one, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies. And I think actually something I've probably learnt is that it's not the normal way in the university to do what I do. And in lots of ways, it's a quiet, slow work. And a work that many people really don't get, I think, in the sort of huge push that there is to sort of like constantly build and grow new things. And finally, here is what I call our shared journey of reconnection. And this is really some of the community that is built around the garden this year. And I talk about it, that shared purpose and belonging, a new imaginary and a rootedness to place. People feel they belong and they're rooted to this place, and a restorative place where people can find community, restoration and hope. And I realise I'm out of time, but I just want to read you one quote from the top there. Paul stood in our kitchen and looked out in the garden for about 2 months, and every time he came in said, "What are they doing today, Gill?" I said, "Oh, they're doing this, they're doing that." And finally he said to me, "What are they doing today, Gill?" I said, "I've no idea, Paul, what they're doing today. You better go out and ask them." And so I went off to a meeting, came back, and Paul was in the garden. Took him 2 months to walk out into that garden. And when I said to him recently, 3 years on, "Tell me what the garden means to you," he said, the garden provides a calming space to gather yourself, your thoughts, to center yourself, to be one with nature. It gives good vibes. And with that, I will leave and let our other speakers take you further on from there. Thank you very much.